Thanks so much for having me back. It's all because of you. Whoever was here last year, I really appreciate it. It's just a fabulous campus you have. And I was born and raised in Palo Alto, so I come back a couple times a year. And this week I was at the Autonomous Vehicle Symposium up in San Francisco. So maybe some of your colleagues, maybe a lot of your competitors too, and a lot of your partners there for the Transportation Research Board meeting. I think next year it'll be in Orlando at about the same time, in case you want to go there. Take the kids, get in some of the sightseeing. So some of this will be a little bit of a repeat because Stefan was not able to be there last year. Got lots of students now over the past 6 or 7 years tackling this question, which is kind of early from this perspective of the sharing of the vehicles and their kind of economic impacts for all of us, and so how popular they're going to be, how quickly they might take off. It's difficult to manufacture these, so they're still not really available. But Austin's going to be getting 6 15-passenger buses in a couple months, and it's going to be circulating the Central Business District. So that's very unusual because it is public roads, so self-driving vehicles, and it will be the shared case, right? So you can see in the lower right-hand corner, that's a city mobile application that they've had for many years now in pedestrians. So slow zones, not a street with other vehicles like we'll have in Austin, but you can see multiple people sit in that vehicle. And of course, many of you have seen these other vehicles around town. So just to start off with a little bit of a definition, in case you're kind of confused by the nomenclature, there's connected and then there's automated. And when I speak today about automated, I'm going to be talking about fully automated, but connected is much cheaper, and this is something Samsung has been able to do for years. And we were expecting, because it has been decades in the making, that the new administration would require this on new vehicles, but because Clinton did not win, we have different leadership, and they're not pushing the dedicated short-range communication technology, which is in about the 5.9 gigahertz band. So there are also many infotainment applications that people clamor for to try to take this away from the safety domain, but it would be very helpful for safety because it gives those within maybe 100 meters range your position very accurately, and speed and direction. So it can help alert drivers if they're in a conventional vehicle. So you can retrofit your existing vehicles for probably $100 or less, but that would be an audible alert, and you would have to know what to do next. So of course, being able to have it talk to a vehicle that has some control over its braking, at least, automated braking should be required. I'm sorry it's not. I think Australia is going to beat us to that standard. You know, depending on who you have in power, you can either slow down on pushing these technologies or speed them up. So this is a lot cheaper than the automation. And of course, you can all go into showrooms today and buy this kind of automation, which is really just helping the driver, not taking over the reins, but a lot of cameras and radar, GPS, of course. But LiDAR is what's really going to help you get through a lot of the settings that you're going to need your vehicle in. And so that's a level 4 or 5 kind of investment. And most auto manufacturers are really in the level 1, level 2 automation right now. So today I'm going to be talking about the level 5 case. Basically, no need for a steering wheel, kind of self-operating from start to finish. And one of the things people ask me is, when are we going to have these? Well, it depends very much on all of us, how quickly we're going to want to adopt this technology, whether we feel comfortable having a computer take the reins, and can we share them, and can we electrify them? So that's very important in terms of getting more renewables into our energy mix and slowing down the pace of climate change, which is creating terrible weather systems and flooding and issues around the world, including here in the Bay Area. So trying to make this, while we're making driving easier, trying to avoid gridlock and lots of other issues like increased emissions of various species. So we've done lots of surveys. This is the 4th of 5 that we've done. We do them across the entire US. It's all online. They're large surveys, so they're about 25 minutes. This one was almost 1,500 people. And of course, every survey or every sample is not completely random sample. So we correct for some of we weight them, that's what the weighting means, to try to reflect the demographics so we don't get too many low education backgrounds, things like that, and we asked them lots of questions about what they currently own, when they think they might be in the market for a new vehicle, what if shared autonomous vehicles like an automated Uber, for example, were available for $1 a mile, would you still buy a new vehicle or maybe start relying on that if the response times were good? And because the NSF was funding this, we were also able to look at electrification among these questions. And we take all that data, create regression models, which I think many of you have done as scientists and engineers. And so being able to predict things based on other data that you have. And in our case, we're going for fleet evolution. And just simple questions right here. These are automatic results once you correct for the demographic biases in any sample. But not too many want it right now, but there's plenty of us, especially here in Silicon Valley, especially among the highly educated and the technology savvy. So it might be 95% in this room, but across America, it's more like 32. And even if they do have a vehicle that could drive itself door to door, they're probably only going to have it in that mode about a third of the time, is what they're thinking, which seems like a real waste of a resource, right? You could get a lot done, but people don't want to lose their skill. They might have to take another vehicle the next day. They need to retain maybe that expertise, and it's really congestion that they hate. And for longer trips, at high speeds, they enjoy it potentially. WTP throughout this presentation stands for willingness to pay, and so we asked them how much you think you would spend for that technology package to make it a fully automated vehicle. And they really want to retain that ability to have a steering wheel in there. So they don't want that extra space, apparently. They want to be able to continue to drive. Maybe they don't like how it was programmed, or maybe it gets hit and the sensors are offset and you need to drive it manually, something like that. We're not exactly sure why they feel like they want to retain it, but on top of the $4,000 or higher that they're willing to pay to get the technology option, they're also willing to pay another $1,000 to keep the steering wheel. And when we ask them about sharing, so these are shared autonomous or fully automated vehicles, the average right now is 44 cents a mile in this country, which is getting very close to what it actually costs to do shared autonomous vehicles, or robo-Priuses, let's say. So you'll see later in the presentation where we actually price it out and we get it down to 50 cents a mile, which is actually lower than what most of the transit companies are already being subsidized to deliver transit for. So if they would enter the market, they already have their budgets covered. They could make transit free if they could do this. Not too many people want to do dynamic ride sharing. So DRS stands for dynamic ride sharing, and I imagine if you have another person in there, that kind of halves the cost of the trip, so you might get a 40% discount. But not too many people want to do that at all, and we went more deeply into that question in the next survey I'll be showing you. How many would do it if we did have that 40% discount in place? Maybe 20%. And I do it all the time. I feel really bad about my carbon footprint, and so I'm sharing rides as much as possible, but as I understand it, that's kind of unusual in San Francisco where the trips are short. But of course, if you're going out to the airport or something, there's lots of people who probably have that same destination. A question we do ask is about empty driving, because this could paralyze the Bay Area. Okay, it could make you Washington, D.C. overnight, just adding 20% more miles onto your roadways. And then that's true of Austin in many cases. It would paralyze you during many hours of the day. So, but Americans don't seem to know that. They're like, sure, let them go empty. I don't care if it's your vehicle or it's an Uber or a Lyft vehicle, 20% is fine. But there still are people like me who think empty driving, at least from a person who owns a privately held automated vehicle, should not be allowed, not even for parking. There's just too many downsides of that. Maybe in the middle of the night, rural towns, if you want to, if it's electric and you've got good renewables in your power feedstock for those power plants that are powering it. But in general, there's just too many things that make that a problematic position. So the fleets, of course, drive empty. Uber drives empty all the time. There's a driver there, but there's nobody in the seats alongside that driver. And so we're trying to get that down through the shared modes where they're dynamically ride sharing. Well, it's different from car sharing. Car sharing is I give you the car after I'm done with it, but ride sharing is where we're together sharing that same ride or a portion of it. So we simulate forward year by year, And we use a lot of different types of regression models. A lot of our response variables or our predictions are discrete, like will you buy a vehicle in this year? Will you let go of a different vehicle? Will it be electric? Will it be battery only electric? So we're using a lot of different econometric techniques there and simulating a lot of different scenarios. So that's the nice thing about models. I know when Sven Biker was here a month ago, he is also an AV expert. He was giving you some predictions, but when you have the equations, you can start testing different cases really quickly. And so we're changing the willingness to pay, and how quickly your willingness to pay goes up over time, because as you've seen with your phones and other devices and products that Samsung makes, the willingness to pay rises over time, especially in the consumer market when the application becomes more understood. And people become habituated, right, to their smartphones and things like that. So the price that we're willing to pay is going to rise over time, but also the technology price is going to come down, just like it does with your products. And so a lot of different decision variables going on here. We're also simulating things. So we've got electric vehicles, hybrid, plug-in hybrids, battery only. And then we've got some land use variables in there. How much closer maybe to the city center or further away people are going to move, because we're worried about sprawl. So people already live pretty far from their workplaces in this country and their children's schools and maybe their dentist, and this can grow worse because people feel, well, my car can drive me, I'll sleep, I'll get some work done, so I'm going to go buy that bigger house in that cheaper county or city, and that could be a real problem. So we were simulating that too, and we were relieved to find that Americans don't seem right now to expect that this is going to change their location decisions that much. And we go forward every year, but I'm just going to show you 2 years here, 2035 and 2050. And you'll see it's not that dramatic. It's hard to replace the US household fleet. Even with a 10% decline in the price of technology and allowing that human vehicle driving still to occur in an autonomous vehicle, so that they still are being sold with the steering wheels in place, we don't get that far. So, allowing that HV option really pushes it up, maybe a 20% bump, but we're still only at 84% in our driveways, in our garages at home by the year 2050 if we let things just play out. And that's the most optimistic scenario that we were willing to try there. By year 2035, maybe 33%. Of course, the Bay Area is a special case, and I think you all live here, so you may see much higher adoption rates, just like you did with the Tesla. So Bay Area, Boston, and Austin, where I live, and other places like that, Singapore, Beijing, you can see the adoption rates much faster, especially with the supply constraints that we're going to have. So I don't think the manufacturers can produce these fast enough once they have the secret sauce and they feel confident selling these. I also don't think they're going to sell them to us. I think they're going to sell them to the fleet operators, because they're going to sign detailed contracts about how these things get used and how the sensors get maintained every night. And you and I are not going to be willing to do that. So anyhow, this visual with the graphic a little bit easier to follow. So just looking over time, we're not really seeing any purchases till 2025 because they're not able to be sold really before then. Maybe a level 3 package, but not a level 5, which is that full autonomy. And this was the most optimistic scenario, of course, getting us to 85% by 2050 because of the technology price drop at a 10% a year. But if government comes in and does this special scenario, which I'm showing second, it takes you from sort of the most pessimistic scenario that we were willing to test to the most optimistic by 2050. So government intervening and saying, sorry, no more sales of human-driven vehicles. Maybe we'll let you have a steering wheel, but it's got to be in autonomous mode on almost all public roads. If government steps in and says that, maybe here in the Bay Area and Austin, probably not across the state of Texas first. We're a little conservative on lots of things. But if Austin's allowed to do that, then you can see the purchases spike, because you won't be able to travel in your own vehicle if you don't have one that's self-driving. And we've seen that before with fuel economy, airbags, all sorts of standards in the automotive realm as well as other places. What's more important to me, and I think to all of us, is how the vehicle miles being traveled. So VMT, really important acronym for people like me, how that looks out on the road, not what's in your garage, at night if you want to use it, but what's actually out there on the roadway. So again, taking a look at those 2 years, 2035 and 2050, lots of numbers here, lots of scenarios on the left-hand side, but I just kind of want to point out now that we're also now, it's not what's in your home's driveway, it's what the fleet operators own. So those are the shared autonomous vehicles, and so they're now in the mix. So we've got 4 columns for each of these cases, and only the fourth of these, or the fourth and the eighth basically, are the human vehicle applications. And so, if there's no government intervention forcing you to take your hands off that wheel and let the car drive itself for safety reasons, then you still might have 8% by 2050. Okay, so might not be enough then to have those smart intersections that I know you're dying to see, where they have mini platoons running through until a pedestrian arrives, of course. As soon as a pedestrian arrives, we have to revert sort of to red and green signals to make sure that they can get across safely. But yeah, that's about where we'd be, and we'll see only 12% of the miles on the ground might be with strangers who don't know one another inside. And remember, there's no driver anymore, so that's a little different than sharing a ride today in Lyft Line, let's say. And then most people, a lot of people using the shared autonomous vehicles, but if people can buy their own, there's still a really strong preference there. Americans are used to that. We have pretty cheap parking almost everywhere. So a lot of people thinking that they're still going to own their own if they can, if the manufacturers will sell it to them at reasonable prices. So, less likely to give up vehicle ownership than we were hoping to see. We'd love to see more shared cases, because when you share, you can get a vehicle that's better sized for your needs. You don't have to have a pickup, okay? When you need to move that mattress once or twice a year, you can call a pickup. In Texas, we have tons of pickups, right? And we have Suburbans and these massive vehicles we really don't need, except for maybe a couple times a year, certain applications. And so you're mostly ordering up a hybrid, small, compact vehicle, very safe, and hopefully not too damaging for the climate. To get to the numbers that I think people probably will want to see, there's going to be a need for government intervention at some point. So it may be that the humans are killing so many pedestrians still that we tell them no longer. In our downtowns, it's only self-driving. So you're going to have to shift into self-driving mode if you're going to penetrate Austin, let's say, or San Jose. And then that will push the purchase of those self-driving vehicles without the steering wheels, hopefully. So the willingness to pay and those price assumptions are really important to what the future is going to look like. So that's up to manufacturers and people like all of you, and how quickly that can happen. We were happy to see that sprawl wasn't an obvious result, at least not the way people are thinking. It's hard for you to imagine how you're going to change your location 20 years from now, 10 years from now. But as far as we can simulate it right now, it's not a big issue, thank goodness. But we aren't simulating what the manufacturers can and will do, so they may very much limit their production to certain styles of vehicle and sell them only to the TNCs, those transportation network companies. And of course, the population is aging. There's all these different things, recessions, expansions going on in the background that we're not simulating here that can move the dial back and forth, of course. I have another survey right after this. In fact, both of these were done last year. This one's more respondents, and it's focused in on long-distance travel. So a lot of you might say, well, I don't need to fly. I can just sleep, and this vehicle will get me to Las Vegas. And so I think the airlines are going to lose a lot of market share. I'm not going to show you those results here, but if you go to my website, it's about a 50% reduction in the passenger miles traveled on airlines in this country to meet those long-distance trip needs. Ride sharing, we went really deep into that. So would you be willing to share a ride with a stranger at night? There's no driver, there's no third party that owns that vehicle in the vehicle with you. There might be video cameras and emergency buttons you can hit, things like that. And they can zoom in on you if something weird is happening in the vehicle and help you out maybe. A little bit about privacy, and then crash ethics, because nobody's been asking those questions. So we went more deeply there. Bigger sample, again, a whole US weighted, about 70 questions. Safety, I think people are getting the notion that this could be a real game changer for deaths. I'm sure many of you know people that have died on the road, and it is the most dangerous thing we do. Even though we don't think about it, it's pretty rare thank goodness, but it is pretty dangerous, and they're still concerned, of course, that we're not sure we can trust these vehicles to manage all those corner cases that do show up, or just basic things like a sensor being kicked, or a pedestrian deciding to play chicken with the vehicle, right? That's a real problem. So you can have still quite a few deaths after you release these vehicles. Most of us do know people, our parents, who could really benefit from having something that drives them to their destinations. A lot of them have reduced their travel because of their eyesight and such. Most are willing at some point in the day maybe to share a short ride with a stranger in this survey. And another 8% will be added to that if you can have some kind of background check. So some of us might be willing to say, okay, yeah, here's all my information. You can see if I have a criminal record, and to the best of the TNC's ability to do that. And then, but we have hardly anybody willing to share at night right now, which is strange. I think that they're actually more willing than they think. But there are, of course, people that are going to be very nervous about that. As we increase the delays to 15 minutes or 30 minutes, we lose a lot of those people who would be willing to share right now, at least as they stated in an online survey. It's done well, but it's not the same thing as reality, of course. Location broadcasting, the apps are already using it, so I noticed it just the other day on Uber Express. You can immediately share your location. Many of you, of course, know how to do that already with your phone. It's possible without the app. But that's helpful to reassuring some people. And if you look at their, let's see, this is people who really don't care about travel delay. They just want to get to their destination. They're very flexible. They're willing to pay a lot of money right now, 74 cents a mile. So that's getting close to really what Uber Express already costs, actually. I think Uber Express beat this for me the other day, 74 cents a mile. And that's with a driver. And drivers are expensive. So we're seeing, for some people, this was not a big share of the U.S. population, but a lot of people who don't even have a car, maybe there's a car in the household, but somebody else controls it, or they're very flexible with their schedule. Maybe they're extroverted. They just want to meet new people, right? So they're pretty willing to pay, even with a lot of delays. We do lots of things with the regression models, so we control for all of these attributes, and then we tweak variables like age, and if we increase age by 1 standard deviation, you can see that the willingness to pay falls about 26%, so older people less willing. We have all these results in the paper, not here in the slideshow, I'm afraid. But not having the ability to drive increases your willingness to pay as well, quite a bit. So going from a 0 to 1 on that indicator variable will bump it up about 38% on average. So now I'm going to take you into the shared autonomous vehicle portion of the slideshow. So this is a self-driving vehicle with that car sharing sort of application, and not ride sharing yet, okay? So this is kind of what Google's envisioning, and of course the City Mobile project at very low speeds was demonstrating. And the reason we think this is such a winner is because most vehicles sit around all day long. Even the newer vehicles, even if you put time buffers on them because they'd have to get to the next passenger, they are not in use, even at the busiest time of day, which is like 6 o'clock in the evening or 5 o'clock in the evening. So all those things, we've got lots of assets sitting there on the ground, and they're taking up space, which is not so good, especially in a land-constrained region like the Bay Area. And the car sharing programs have been growing. They're still not major, but they have been growing, especially in the cities. And the shared autonomous vehicles make them so much more attractive because they come to you. And if while you're grocery shopping, the vehicle goes to somebody else, don't worry, another vehicle will come and get you with your bag. So you have that certainty. So it's no geofence, no having to return the vehicle where you picked it up like we've had in the past with some of our car sharing arrangements. And then we started small. So this was about 6-7 years ago. We just started micro-simulating people and the cars, and we did it on a town, basically a 10-mile by 10-mile small town with quarter-mile grid, very simple, and we added demand, so trip generation and also attractions using Poisson processes across these quarter-mile grid cells that reflected the average intensity of trip making in, let's say, Austin, in the sort of the 10 mile by 10 mile core of Austin. We used National Household Travel Survey data to get a sense of how long people would stay at their destinations, how long their trips would be in different directions, and we just randomly simulated this for 100 days worth of travel to see how well a fleet of shared vehicles could serve this. We didn't model congestion or anything, although we did have density, slower speeds, let's say, in the core, and slower speeds at certain times of day, things like that. And we just started these vehicles overnight, kind of wherever they ended the day before, they started the next day, and they're going throughout to serve passengers at each of the nodes in this 10 mile by 10 mile system. And the red hatch lines are relocating, so they're recognizing that there's too many vehicles maybe in their little region, the 2 mile by 2 mile neighborhoods, and so they're shifting out of there if they can to get to a better position before a new call comes in and they're off to go get that person and take him or her to the destination. So this is one vehicle over the course of a day. He ended up pretty close to where he started, which is strange. He served about 30 trips. They weren't super long because this is a small town, so they weren't allowed to leave, which was kind of fake. But you know, we did everything as realistically as we could with this very first application. And we were finding that if the vehicle were to serve the same number of trips, let's say, that an average vehicle would, it was like they were 10 times as busy, 9 to 13 times as busy. They were doing the work of 10 vehicles, basically, 10 passenger household vehicles right now. So that's a lot of vehicles you could get rid of. It doesn't mean that you get rid of congestion, okay, because they do add some driving. So they're driving around a lot more each day, and part of that is empty. So that's additional congestion on your roadways. Hopefully it's a hybrid vehicle, hopefully it's a small vehicle, so it doesn't maybe look as bad as driving a big Suburban around empty. The wait times are actually about 0.3 minutes because we're doing this on a 5-minute horizon, so we added in a half horizon to make it, you know, the expected trip, I guess, wait time that you would expect, maybe 2.8. So very good levels of service, and of course, we're already seeing this with Uber and Lyft. You guys are seeing this regularly when you call those vehicles in this region, especially in San Francisco and Central Business District. So this is a small town, wasn't the whole Bay Area. We looked at emissions. We were using a smaller vehicle, more of a right-sized vehicle, rather than a bunch of pickup trucks or something like that. So greenhouse gases went down, not that much because there is that empty driving that's using fuel, but volatile organic compounds and like carbon monoxide went down a lot. And that's because these vehicles stayed warm. Their engines stayed warm, their catalytic converters stayed warm. They were clean vehicles right from the get-go for most of the day. And so that was very nice. Of course, the smaller vehicles are more fuel efficient typically, but also we need less parking infrastructure, which has embodied energy. Okay? All that concrete, all that steel, these beautiful buildings, even if you didn't light or heat or you climate control this place, it would have an energy footprint, right? So we're looking at all that. We're trying to do life cycle analysis. And then we, of course, get bigger. We go 12 mile by 24 mile. This is Austin, by the way. That's downtown, kind of. And that's the I-35 corridor. So you see a lot of trip-making intensity up and down. This is I-35. Takes NAFTA freight trade from Mexico all the way up to Canada. And we're using a real network now. But it's still a small case. People are not allowed to leave this 12 by 24 mile region. And this is just the Euclidean segments as it's going around. It's also got some relocation going on with the red to try to put it in a better position, just like TNC drivers will do. If there's a festival or something going on, they know about it. They're trying to match that thoughtfully rather than purely randomly. But these vehicles are really following the actual network in this case. And we allowed ride sharing in this case, so not just handing off the vehicle to a new traveler at the end of the trip. And it stayed very busy. We ended up simulating almost 300,000 passenger trips during the day, and the wait time stayed the same, even though it was 3 times as big a region, let's say. So lots of statistics. I'm not going to bore you with that, but the vehicle replacement rates didn't change too much. That was interesting. And if we use dynamic ride sharing, so with dynamic ride sharing, you were able to hit what we did with that small town application. So that was nice to see, because these trip lengths were much more realistic now in this 12 mile by 24 mile region. And we started quantifying it in terms of costs, okay? And this is where you have to pay for the empty travel that's associated kind of with your trip on average. And the vehicles are so heavily used, they have to be retired every 2 years rather than every 16 years like your vehicle might be. And then we started testing electric vehicles. So the problem with electric vehicles, if they're battery-only electric vehicles like the Leaf and the Model S, is they take longer to fuel, and there aren't any refueling stations hardly in many regions. So we had to create them, and there weren't that many, so there was a fair amount of driving getting to them. We also went much bigger, but we went back to a grid for this first 100-mile by 100-mile case. And we used Austin sort of travel patterns or densities to get a sense of that. But the ride sharing continues to save emissions. If you have enough people using the system, as you can imagine with ride sharing, you can get vehicle miles traveled to go negative, to fall. Okay, so you could start releasing capacity on your roadways. Of course, there's plenty of people who will eat it up right away. If we build more lanes, they will congest very quickly here in this region because there's a lot of pent-up demand. So you're going to need congestion pricing, and I advocate for credit-based congestion pricing. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do, let's do the whole 6-county region. So this is a 2 million population, Austin, and we've got the full network with houses and address-based pickups and drop-offs, and we're doing the electric. And the nice thing about electric is you can do inductive charging, so you don't actually have to attach, or you can use a robotic arm. Maybe you can do that for gasoline as well. A little messier, but kind of clean process, and so you don't need to pay for labor there. But you do need attendants roving around to kind of take a look at the outside of the vehicles, make sure things are staying clean inside. You might have cameras inside also to keep track. And now the simulation gets a little bit trickier because we have to figure out whether there's enough stations. We don't want to strand any of our Leafs or our Model S's, maybe Model 3s in the future. So it's more complicated. We have to create those charging stations. And it really depends on the vehicle that we choose. So I want you to tell me, these are both images of Austin. This was one scenario, and this was another scenario. One of these had the long-range vehicles, one of these had the short-range vehicles. This 200-mile versus the 60-mile range battery-only electric vehicle. Who thinks this was for the 60-mile range battery electric vehicle, and this one was for the 200-mile range battery electric vehicle? You guys willing to guess? I'd love to see a show of hands. Okay, who thinks this was for the 200-mile range vehicle and this is for the 60? You guys are so much better than the graduate students. Yes, nice job. We had no takers on that first question. So you're absolutely right. With the long-range vehicles, you don't need that many stations, so that's the 200-mile range case. But I recommend you do build a lot of stations. I recommend you put them all over so your vehicles aren't chasing those stations during the day. And they can quickly get in. It'll be a smaller station. So the cost will scale more or less with size, I think. But you could get away with very few. And this is what it looks like downtown with the 60-mile range vehicle. So this would be a Nissan Leaf whose battery has been downsized. And there's plenty. You can move these around a bit and still not strand the vehicle, of course. There's plenty of underutilized space. And these are, even though this is downtown Austin, this is the core of Austin, so this is going to be the trickiest one, I think, to site. Maybe this one and this one as well. But there are dead zones in there, small places. The cars don't care if it's pretty. They don't mind charging there. So you can get land pretty cheaply, even in some of those hot spots. And we went ahead and we simulated several use cases. We started with hybrid electric. So it's not a battery only. It's not a Leaf. It's not a Tesla. It's a hybrid, but it's hard to beat. It's the Prius, okay, which many of you, I think, drive. It has a long range. It says 525-mile range. And refuels very quickly, 2 minutes. We didn't need many charging stations, or gas stations, I should say, for this vehicle because it has such a long range. And we used about 6,000 vehicles, or 5,893, across the 6-county region. We didn't serve all trips. I think we served maybe, of all the trip making that goes on in the region, I think we were serving on the order of 3 or 5%. And there were some people we had to abandon. So that 1.62 are the people who were just so unlucky. Maybe the called in the middle of the night from some rural location. We just couldn't get to them within 30 minutes. So we had to we assumed they would let go of the call. They would cancel their trip. And the wait times are still very reasonable, even though we've got lots of rural locations in this 6-county region. And then we did the all-electric cases. So there's 5 here. The one that I've highlighted is fast charging. That's a 30-minute charge, and it's a long-range vehicle. It's the 200-mile, which is not as long as those of you with Teslas typically buy. You guys buy the big battery packs. So we're using the same size fleet to be fair here, and you'll see a lot more stations needed on the, let me see, is this? Yeah, okay, so a lot more stations needed if you're going to do the electric, because they just can't go as far. Their ranges are much shorter than that Prius. And of course, they have long charging times, so that you may show up and the charging cord be already occupied, or the inductive charger being already occupied. So we had to think about all of that. It was much more complicated. But this case did really well. Still, it was able to serve trips in about an average of 5.5 minutes instead of 4.5 minutes. So that was nice to see. But as we'll see in a bit, it's not able to compete on price yet, because we have to build those charging stations, and they're not cheap unless California subsidizes us, okay? So without subsidy, it is not cheap to do it, but that's the case that we would definitely do. We would get the longer range vehicle, and we'd get the DC fast chargers in there. They cost more, but they're worth it if you're going to compete with an all-electric fleet. Fleet size, of course, just scaling that up and down will change the response times quite a bit. The longer charge times created problems on those response times. They also meant many people ended up having to wait more than 30 minutes, so they would have opted out of the system. So the urban core had very short response times, as you can imagine, 2 minutes, basically. It's the periphery that's tougher to serve. But guess what? I think those people can anticipate most of their trips. You know, unless your wife goes into labor or something, you can anticipate your trip by half an hour, and you can pre-call the vehicle, and then you will not have to wait. And that's what, you know, many people do on their phones already if they're in a situation where there's not a lot of cars around to call. So lots of cost assumptions to make the all-electric situation happen, right? There's a lot of uncertainty there still, especially on those charging stations. There's, of course, vehicle maintenance, administration costs, back office costs, all these things that go on when you're running a system like this. Uber doesn't have a lot of cost because, you know, it's trying to keep things as simple as possible. But if you're going to own the vehicles, it gets costly. So we have ranges on all of these because they do vary already, and they will continue to vary, hopefully falling over time. And we then looked at that Prius case example, which is not an all-electric vehicle. It's just a hybrid vehicle, and it was able to serve the trips at 45 cents per revenue mile. So there's somebody in the vehicle, and that was great. The others all tracked around 59 cents a mile, which was interesting. It was very stable, even though there were very different technologies being used. They just ended up being about the same. And so profitability was greatest on the Prius. It's tough to beat a Prius. But that other case example that I gave you, if you really want to protect the environment, you want to shift to renewables in your power plant feedstocks, then that's the one to go for and maximize profitability. And you can still do it on the subsidies that we provide our transit providers already. You do have to worry about how you move disabled people and things like that. There's always those special cases. So people in wheelchairs, things like that, that buses handle, that's trickier when you've got a driverless Prius, right? So last thing, all that extra driving. So not only are the shared autonomous vehicles driving around a bit empty, but you might end up going a lot further, and your parents and grandparents and children might end up doing a lot more driving because we're making driving easier. We're getting people out of Caltrain and out of BART and onto the roads, and that's a real problem. And New York has already seen this with the TNCs. So it's a lot worse than that 11% I was showing you earlier. It's a lot worse than that. It's about 30%. So long term, 30% more, it will cripple our regions if we allow that onto our roadways. So this example was just looking at the added driving because travel time is not as onerous because you're not actually holding onto the wheel and dealing with traffic. You're likely to go further, in addition to those without driver's licenses being able to do it. And so Michele Simone, a graduate student from Italy, went ahead and simulated very recently. You're the first people to see this, a few scenarios. I'm sorry, about the shading going on there, but these are just the mode splits for the Austin region. And if we assume people can easily buy these on their own, most will. So 84% of trip making would be done by your own self-driving vehicle. And so human-driven cars would be a small portion in the year 2040. Passenger transit, pretty low. Walk, bike, very low. But if we bring the price of the SAVs down and we don't sell a lot of those AVs directly to households, then you've got a lot of, let's see this, well, you've got still a lot of people sticking with their cars and a fair number moving into that shared fleet. And then finally, the base scenario where there are no SAVs or AVs, you've got that 84% again for the car, or car use versus private AV use. So what we did, because of the added driving that comes with making travel easier, we didn't let old people and young people and new trips be made. We really just looked at the current drivers who are driving about 2.8 million miles a day in that region in the base scenario with no automation, and the total travel hours per day in terms of vehicle hours on the roadway. And we let people have those private AVs. Not everybody owned one, but those who thought it was economically wise and made sense for them. We had, of course, more driving. We weren't allowing them to send them around empty to go pick up their spouses or their kids or go park for them. So this is kind of a restrictive scenario, but it was already enough to notice a big jump, I guess, in delay. And then with the shared autonomous vehicles, because they make travel so easy, they add another 10% to the vehicle miles traveled each day, and then they push the total delay up quite a bit, about 20-25%. So pricing is something that we think your devices and your algorithms can really handle well. And Singapore does this, but not with the kind of technology that we need. And China needs to do this. India is probably going to do it. And of course, Austin, Bay Area, and others are going to do it. But in the meantime, we have simple things like distance-based tolls that you can do with GPS. You have an odometer reading. You don't need to retrofit the vehicle at all. You could just maybe toll the links that are most congested. So if you look at their volume to capacity ratios, what's most congested? You could use marginal cost pricing, which some of you have heard about. So those of you who've taken economics, maybe you remember this strategy, where you charge people for the impact that they have on others. So the true costs of their adding themselves to that Highway 85 at 8 a.m. versus 9 a.m. The cost is varying depending on when you do it, but it's the best strategy. Here's how the vehicle miles travel, that we can push VMT down. The link-based scheme, I guess, was pretty aggressive, and it brought VMT down the most, but it didn't bring delays down the most. So the green strategy, that marginal cost pricing strategy, was able to bring traffic delays down the most, and definitely that's what we're after. We're trying to save you guys time. Your time is very valuable, and so is that of your family members and your friends. So trying to get you guys moving, keep those roadways moving rather than becoming parking lots. So that is kind of the best strategy, and that's something I think you guys really can do with your devices. So just to wrap it up here, tremendous benefits in terms of safety and perceived value of time savings and maybe labor savings coming from these automation, but also the connectivity is very helpful. So they're kind of synergistic. Of course, connectivity is much cheaper to add than automation. The SAVs, those shared autonomous vehicles that Uber and Lyft and Enterprise and Ford and probably Volvo and Daimler are all very excited about, can replace a lot of personally owned vehicles if we let them, okay? But we do think that that's what auto manufacturers are signaling they're going to sell to first. So that's how you're going to get your first taste of self-driving from most Americans, is through the shared fleets. They do add MT-VMT unless you do a lot of ride sharing, that dynamic ride sharing, that DRS, so they will be adding congestion. But they might have really valuable emissions benefits, because we can get rid of a lot of those F-150 pickup trucks and Suburbans and other things that are really much less efficient, especially on a cold day. The cold starts are tremendous on those vehicles. So also travel cost savings. You right-size your vehicle. You only buy it when you need it, just for the distance that you need. That's pretty valuable in all sorts of markets. So the system's going to congest. until we force those auto manufacturers to follow at half-minute headways and we get really high rates of adoption such that we can double the capacities at our signalized intersections with, fancy tools with intersection management, we're going to really need pricing. And you already need it. We already need it. But our vehicles don't really enable it that easily right now. So the retrofitting that would have to go on is tricky. And also the policy. When we do congestion pricing, like in Texas, we have pricing, they price very high. And all that money goes right to the DOT or the Regional Mobility Authority, and it doesn't go back to you. You're the one who owns the road. All of us as a society own that shared resource, that constrained space. It's like a commons, right? And we have this tragedy of the commons going on. So why doesn't that money come right back to us in the form of credits? So a travel budget each month, and you guys can make this happen with your phones. You can make it happen on aftermarket devices, added to vehicles. You can make it happen, of course, on the assembly line. But, of course, the administrator is separate. They have the budgets being allocated every month. It might be $20 or $30, and if you need to travel more than that, you pay out of pocket. But guess what? You're suddenly making it to your meetings on time. And that whole cost of unreliability and those lengthier travel times are disappearing. Even in places like Yosemite, where Stefan got stuck this past weekend, I think. So lots of opportunities. Of course, we'd be nice to also be charging the real cost of gasoline and petroleum, which involves a lot of military expenses in the Middle East, as you know. Those kinds of things are places for all of us as community members to intervene, but Samsung can really be a global leader, I think, in retrofitting existing vehicles and helping the new vehicles, especially those with the smart technology. They're going to have really good positional accuracy. They can protect the accounts so that big government doesn't know where you were. Big government doesn't want to really know where you are generally. They like third parties to manage that. Samsung could easily manage that kind of data and just charge the total and have random audits. So in case you think you may be able to tamper with the device that we have on your vehicle, they can randomly audit to make sure that you can match some of the photographs that we have at random locations of your position so that you did pay the proper congestion bill at the end of the month. But it's credit-based, so everybody's got some money to work with, and that money doesn't have to be used on the road. It can be used for shared bikes. It can be used for boat rides, maybe free movie tickets, but you generally don't want to cash it out because people will pretend they live in regions that have credit-based congestion pricing and they won't really be there, so they'll take the cash and run. So it needs to be something that's consumed locally. Dynamic ride sharing, of course, those algorithms are tricky. Uber Express is still working out a lot of tweaks, and I know many of you have excellent ideas on how to assign vehicles and how to assign trips en route, things like that. Safety is a really big one. I have a project right now for the Texas DOT about wildlife protection, and if we have cameras on our vehicles, we'll be able to determine when animals are approaching and send that signal back. If there's nearby vehicles, they'll receive it, or if we have roadside devices that are just passing the message that herded deer is approaching or one deer was just spotted, things like that. Really save a lot of lives, not just of the animals, but of you and me. There's law enforcement, maybe it's speeding, maybe it's something else, red light running, whatever. A lot of this can happen now because of these smarter vehicles. So I'd love to talk with anybody more about that, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, what do you see is going to happen ultimately with public transportation? Do you think that cities will continue to invest to expand and build out public transportation to hopefully alleviate some of these congestion concerns that you guys, or do you see that sort of starting to diminish as more autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think because these systems take so long to plan and approve and to build and then start operating, and then the subsidies required long term, I don't think they're going to build many more. I do think we might free up a lot of curb space and have more dedicated lanes for a more like a rapid transit, even with just buses. And I hope those buses will be automated and electrified too. Diesel's very nasty, we've learned. So we have papers about that, and it's a real no-brainer. you can get rid of the driver. Those are very expensive. That's part of why we have such big buses, is because the driver, and that's a driver that gets an 8-hour shift. There's a lot of inefficiencies. They already have the money. Even if they just pay Uber to do it for 3 years and then Lyft to do it for 3 years and somebody else, so they've got these rolling contracts to make sure that they're serving. And they'll be a lot more demand responsive. They can turn off the mini buses at certain times of day, and they can play nice with the smaller vehicles. So in the lower density neighborhoods, things like that. That's where I would do it. And Austin, is already experimenting, as you heard. So I think that's what we'll see.
Hey there. So I realize you were kind of basing this presentation very much around kind of an L5 world to a certain extent. But currently there are no self-driving cars for sale to anyone. There are very few even technically competent vehicles on the road right now. One of the biggest issues with automated vehicles right now is the fact that people just don't understand them. And we're also very much at the top of a hype cycle that we're not going to really realize for at least another 20 years for the kind of L5 stuff you're talking about. Two things I'm curious about. First of all, because this is an L5 focused presentation, you said earlier, the first experience many people have in a shared vehicle. Well, I don't really quite buy that, because the fact that there's going to be a lot more privately owned vehicles with L2 and L3 features coming out over time. That's going to actually be most people's first
Sure, but that's not an L5 experience.
Right, well, I guess what I'm saying is the experience they're going to have in an L2-3 car is going to drastically influence what their perception of an L5 vehicle is going to be.
Yes.
This is a really circuitous way of saying, how confident are you in people's opinions, ideas, rationales for using this technology when, if you look at a survey from 15 years ago about what people would like in a mobile communication device, they didn't want any of the stuff that's on my iPhone or my Samsung phone. So the lack of education and communication about this kind of thing, I'm really kind of curious how well these kind of stats and ideas are going to hold up 10 years in the future, or even 2 years in the future.
Right. So a lot of times, like when we ask about tolling, in other surveys, we'll say, have you ever been in a tolled situation? Now we've all been in elevators, which are autonomous vehicles, and almost all of us have been in people movers on guide rails, which are autonomous vehicles, and we've all been in cars, and we've all had people chauffeur us. So it's not like we have no idea. A phone is kind of different. A lot of these apps are very unusual things, easy to create because it's all electronic, but maybe code it. But yeah, this is a more physical experience that I think a lot of people have had, but going fast, maybe airplanes are the closest thing, having somebody else at the wheel and having to trust your life to, but you're watching all these other people doing it, and that's very calming. And so just seeing other people doing it is really reasonable. And I think having it happen in maybe on the airport side and being in people movers around the tarmac or something, I think people are going to have a lot of those experiences too. And I don't think it's so different, because we've been chauffeured by taxi drivers for decades. That I don't think it's so different. We're not asking them, what would you like it to do? But we're trying to figure out where people already go and how difficult and onerous it is. And when I go to Las Vegas, my husband drives, right? So I'm used to that. I don't get his attention as much as maybe I could if he weren't driving, but it's not that different. So I'm not too worried. But yeah, the simulators are also kind of fake, the simulators that people are designing and getting data on. So it is hard to predict. You just ultimately have to kind of go with your gut. And I don't think we need a specific prediction right now. Is there something you had in mind that it's going to change your investment decision quite a lot? We didn't let them start buying until 2025, for example, and it was very expensive. It was like $50,000 markup, so very few people could adopt at that point.
When you were doing cost per mile of the different vehicle scenarios, did you do a sensitivity to energy cost analysis, and also did you compare that to the cost of private vehicles?
So sensitivity, you mean forecasting forward to 2050? on the energy price?
Right. I mean, if you had 2 cents a kilowatt hour versus 20 cents a
Right.
kilowatt hour, how much?
No, we didn't. I don't think we told them. Well, no, we probably did tell them how much kilowatt hours are, but we didn't give them different prices and see how they might do that differently on the online survey. So yeah, we haven't run any scenarios like that. Now the vehicle itself, the base price of the vehicle, yes, we can play with and we can run those scenarios, but the kilowatt hour costing scenarios, I don't think we could run with the questions we asked.
Well, follow up to that question, that kind of plays into what he was saying is, do you believe that your respondents are aware of how much their cars cost per mile?
No, they don't. No, Americans and most people don't. It's very hidden, right? You buy gas every 2 weeks to 8 weeks or something if you drive a Prius. And yeah, it really depends on your commute. But yeah, people don't really have any idea. They think the gas tax is something huge and awful, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they're really paying.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm an engineer working on the positioning for autonomous driving.
Great.
And what I'm doing about to make sure the cars can be more precise and avoid the collision and avoid the pedestrians. And you mentioned at the end of that, said that you have safety issues. I want to know from the perspective of transportation, and what safety issue that you gonna research, that you consider?
Well, we've looked at the existing crashes to try to anticipate how many crashes would be saved, right? Because everybody says 94% of crashes involve some human error. There are other issues in many of those crashes too. It's not just the human behind the wheel, but we look at the crash statistics that exist and figure out, we parse them into maybe 80 different collision types, and they are of course different percentages of the collisions and the costs from crashes each year, and which technologies would influence which crashes, and would they reduce the severity or would they avoid the crash altogether? And so we have a paper about that, and I think we think maybe 84% of the cost could be avoided as long as you don't have those pedestrians playing chicken and things like that with these smart cars. So that might be a little optimistic, but yeah, that's a lot, because crashes cost, I don't know, 4 times what congestion costs every year in this country. And again, they're so rare that you don't think about it, but when they happen, your insurance company pays a lot of money, and so do you and your family, just trying to keep up with the loss of a car for a week or something and buying a new one. So it's a big cost. I'm glad you're working on it.
All right. Well, thank you for the presentation. It's pretty amazing. So exactly, I'm looking forward down the road, 5 years, 10 years, be realistic. But my question is about the something that maybe not showing here. It's going to be impact to the society. What I mean is by the time when it's happened, so driver will lose their job, right? Taxi will gone, and everything else, right? So how about the new opportunities for business and to the society?
Yeah, it's a skilled labor issue, really, and we've seen this before, and they've looked at it over time. Worst case scenario, I think worst case scenario is a 0.5 percentage point extra unemployment, and they're thinking maybe year 2040, especially if we're in a recession in that year. It'll be hard to absorb those employees, but we're at a real loss or under supply of truck drivers right now, as you may know. We've got lots of people working part-time in the TNC industry in places like the Bay Area, and they seem to enjoy it because they have flexibility, but they're not going to have that flexibility eventually. But it's going to be slow because they cannot produce these vehicles fast enough to meet the demand. And so certain regions are going to have it and others are not. And so maybe your TNC drivers will move to Waco, Texas, or someplace like that, where they still, or Dallas or something, where the manufacturers are not sending the vehicles and the fleet operators are not putting them on the street. So, but yeah, they're going to have more technical jobs. So the electronics of this and just the vehicle repair, the sensor repair and the testing, those kinds of things. But I think overall, yeah, it is a job loser. But there are new things, that we can't even imagine. Your colleague was mentioning that may come up, new uses they've seen in the past. So they've looked at examples of loss of workers in the past in the transportation and other industries and how they get reabsorbed. It's tough. You got to be flexible, and ideally you should have a bachelor's degree in engineering or science.
Talking about, I'm asking the business
Right.
Talking about like a service and repairing, right? So how about the other? We are not seeing the opportunity.
So opportunities for you, for Samsung? Okay.
So maybe let's take that
Okay.
as a
We're going to let
bilateral
you guys
discussion.
go. I'm going to stay
Uh,
here, but thank you so much for having me again. It's been a
and
pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.